Welcome to The Power of the P, the podcast designed to help you become empowered in your truth, free of fear. I'm E.L. Brooks, your host, here to bring you expert advice and effective tools based on neuroscience to help you deal with all the stressors in life, relationships, and work. I'm here to keep you off that struggle bus through the power of the P. Are you ready? Then let's go. Welcome to The Power of the P, episode number 4. Thank you for tuning in, as always. If you're not familiar with the show's format, it's like a Dear John life advice show, except for I'm EL. So it's Dear EL, where followers and subscribers send in questions of the things that they're dealing and struggling with. And I'll pick one, sometimes two questions, and I'll give insight, provide some effective tools that is always backed in neuroscience, and I'll provide one key takeaway at the end to log into your memory to help you become more resilient and emotionally stable. Today, we have an email from Katrina who wants to control her temper. And this is so important, Katrina, because I believe when we're able to dissolve our individual anger issues, we're able to see the world through a different lens. And that's what happened to me. I was that angry black man, so to speak, right? Who was really scared and desperately wanting love. And that made me act out of anger a lot of the times, not really knowing why. Once I was able to observe and reflect on the reasons why I was angry, I was able to really dissolve that pilot light that ignited my flame of fury. So the reason I picked this email is because emotional intelligence is the key to life. It's the key to our longevity, actually. It's the key to sustainable relationships, and quality relationships is the major contributor to our longevity. We're a social species, and when we're not getting along with each other, destruction ensues. And we're witnessing that all across the world, as a lot of people feel that we're the most divided as a society. And the easiest way to fix this is for all of us to develop emotional intelligence. So our key objective today is to learn how to develop more emotional intelligence. We're going to learn about the 5 components of emotional intelligence, and I'm going to give you an effective tool backed by neuroscience to help you develop and improve the most important aspect of emotional intelligence, which is intrapersonal intelligence. And that's your self-awareness and your connection to your inner world. So let's jump into Katrina's email. Katrina writes, "Hey EL, I'm reaching out to seek advice on controlling my temper. It's gotten way out of hand. Recently, I've been struggling with controlling my emotions, particularly when I'm faced with conflicts. I'm afraid I'm running my husband and my sister off because of my destructive behavior. I recognize that allowing my temper to flare up not only affects my relationships, but also takes a toll on my own health. I'm exhausted, but I'm determined to work on this aspect of myself before it's too late. My husband and I are currently sleeping in separate rooms because I'm too stubborn to tell him how I really feel. I have so much anger in my heart that it doesn't allow me to say the things that I really want to say. I don't want to be like this anymore, so I appreciate any help and advice that you can share as I desperately need it." Signed, Katrina S. Now, full transparency, I'm now working with Katrina. So because of that, I needed to honor our privacy agreement. So I had to ask her if I could share her original email on this podcast, which she gave me permission to do so. As you can see, Katrina hit what I refer to as the wall of truth that moves us to take action. Now, for this particular podcast, let's establish and explore 3 key premises. Premise number 1 is you don't know what you don't know, and what you don't know is far greater than what you think you currently know. Socrates' open mind is always needed for growth and expansion because we all have blind spots and we all have gaps. Premise number 2 is consider the wisdom of Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, and Napoleon Hill. And all of them believe that everything is energy, vibration, frequency, however you wish to refer to it as. And that energy is either in concert and harmony, or it's incongruent and dissonant, one or the other. If you're familiar with music, you may be aware of a major chord and a minor chord, the 2 basic chords, right? But if you play them simultaneously, it creates dissonance. And that's similar to our brain waves when we're not vibrating in harmony. The human flaw of the psyche creates what is known as cognitive dissonance. That's our negative self-talk. It's simply our brain and our body being in opposition, operating within 2 energies simultaneously. And those 2 energies are fear and love. It's the fear that creates the dissonance. Premise number 3 is there are 2 forms of energy that motivate us. Everything that we do is either through the empowerment of love or the disempowerment of fear. And love is considered that move towards motivation. That's harmony, that's being in concert, that's aligned. It's really integrated, right? And fear is considered the move away from motivation. That's incongruent, dissonance. It's really about separation.
We have to realize this. We don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are vibrationally. So, going back to premise number two, if everything is energy and you're vibrational, a negative emotion like anger is a physical translation of conflicting vibrations. It introduces resistance to your base vibration because our base vibration or default setting is love, and I can prove it. Example, when you feel joy, when you feel love, when you feel elation, there's no contradicting thought within you, right? You're in harmony, in concert with all that you are. Your base, which is your soul connected to source, and your human mind and body. However, when you're frustrated or angry, there's a contradictory thought, meaning what the source energy within you thinks about this right now and what you're thinking about this right now are not vibing. Love energy is expansive, it's integrating, and fear energy is contracting, it's separating. So when you're angry, there's a chain reaction that happens. There's a conscious loss of connection via our meaning making machine, something or someone that we've attached ourselves to. And there's an unconscious loss of connection to source, and both trigger a physical loss of connection. It's that mind body connection, right? You're perceiving a loss of some sort, a loss of freedom, respect, dignity, the list goes on. But it's also around a meaning of loss. And now that vibrational thought that you're having is not in harmony with the source's thought. So both trigger a loss of connection to your logical brain, your prefrontal cortex. There's an aha moment. Anger is the same energy, it never changes. So the anger that you felt when you were 2 years old, when someone took your favorite toy away and told you it was bedtime, that anger that triggered an unconscious loss of connection to your toy as part of your identity is the same anger that you feel when you're 20, when you're 30, when you're 40, and someone disrespects you or doesn't love you. You get triggered. Defining moment. You unconsciously make the event mean something. All defining moments create emotions, positive or negative, depending on the meaning that we apply to it. How we define it is the key. All emotions are associated with meanings, which is why emotions and feelings are fleeting. In fact, according to Harvard brain scientist Dr. Taylor, any remaining emotional response is just a person choosing to stay in that emotional loop because they're making it mean something. This is so key to becoming emotionally stable. We're the only species on the planet that can recreate our suffering from thought alone. We can make something mean something, and that can create a somatic reaction. So Dr. Taylor says 90 seconds is all it takes to identify an emotion and allow it to dissipate while you simply notice it. When you're stressed, pause 90 seconds and labeling your emotions and feelings like I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling frustrated, that tamps down the activity in the amygdala. And MRI studies of the brain show that emotional labeling calms down the region involved in angry outbursts and helps you regain control. That's because you're actually moving back into your rational part of the brain. You move from the limbic system back to your prefrontal cortex, where you can now start to apply critical thinking. So anger, when you go back in time, anger is associated with perceived loss. You view that loss as a real threat. Well, at least your amygdala does. And your amygdala is a small part of your brain that has a really big job. It's the major processing center for all of your emotions. And it also links your emotions to other brain functions like memory and learning, and most importantly, your senses. And when your amygdala is not working right and sending out all of these false alarms, it contributes to disruptive feelings and symptoms. The signal to the amygdala is the fastest processor in the brain, and it's by design because it's meant to protect you from danger. Back in the day, it literally meant the difference between life and death. It controls your fight, flight, freeze response, and it prepares you to act at lightning speed. It mobilizes or immobilizes you depending on other factors that causes you to fight or flee. This is why emotions trumps logic. It's automatic. It's quicker than you can ever think. And this is why you should never try to make any major decisions while you're angry. Because again, you're void of most of your intelligence. You're too emotional. And it's important to have an understanding of what emotional means. So let's define it. Emotions are associated with meanings. We give meanings to an event, and based on that meaning, it creates an emotion, right? So most of us have a set of internal expectations and preferences that act as filters. So when we observe an external event, we scrub it against our expectations and our preferences, and that invokes a positive or a negative reaction within our bodies. And the size of the reaction depends on how attached we are to our expectations and our preferences compared to the event that we're observing. We'll dive more into this when we review the equations of emotions. This is why, if you recall, I think it was in episode 2, Finding Yourself, I mentioned one of the first principles you learn when you work with me is to set your intentions with no attachments to outcome. And what that really means is to have no expectations. So if you've been watching my latest videos, you know that I like to try and codify and formulate everything to bring more clarity and understanding to help people quickly apply and retain information. So let's look at a few equations around emotions. So before we get into what I believe is the real equation of emotions, let's review what I call the happiness equation for the fixed condition mind. Solve for happy says that the formula to happy is this equation. The formula is true for people with a fixed condition mind. And this is a great formula to visualize in order to gain more perspective and have some awareness around how the mind and the nervous system compares. But there's another equation by Sean Webb that brought it all home for me. To me, Sean's equation explains the process of how negative emotions get created, which is important to point out. To me, if you understand the process of how something gets created, you now have the awareness to disrupt that process. And this is how you can achieve a breakthrough. Now let's dive into the equation of emotions, uses and preferences minus reality as perceived, which is key, equals an emotional reaction. So you need to know that the nervous system is a big comparator. It looks for two different things to make every decision. So number one is, what is the expectation and preference of what is going on in the environment? And that is your set filters that you have. And then number two is versus the perception of the perceived reality that is going on. That is the filters that allows you to see based on a certain lens, right? And so remember, we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are vibrationally. So if we're vibrating in fear, we're going to see the glass as half empty. If we're vibrating in love, we're going to see it as half full. It's all about the power of the P, which is the power of perspective, right? The next thing that it does is it compares those two things and assigns meaning to it. Now, here's where it gets tricky. My decades of working with people and observing people, what I've found is that there are two types of expectations. There's those that have a very rigid should and shouldn't filter, and those that have a expectation filter that is rooted in fantasy, one or the other. And it's important to note that all of this typically resides outside of our conscious awareness. This is happening automatically all the time. So a person with a should and shouldn't expectancy has a rigid application. It's in judgment as an act of superiority, and it's based in criticism as a form of correctiveness. It should be this way because that's the only way I see it, or that's the only way that I choose to see it because of a fixed conditioned mindset that is not allowing me to grow. And I say that half jokingly, right? But seriously, anyone that has should and shouldn't filters usually suffers from perfectionism, and perfectionism is unrealistic. It's unachievable and it's fantasy based, and it's an illusion to me. To me, it's really a zero-sum game because there's no room for grace or imperfection. But imperfection is real and is possible. So you're eliminating a big part of reality. Psychologists say that it's really a cover-up or a mask around their own insecurities, around their own lack and inadequacy narratives. Things have to be perfect because deep down inside, they haven't addressed their hidden perception around their own imperfections. People that have this type of expectations are always disappointed because their reality based in fantasy hardly matches up with life's real reality. So there's a lot of triggering. And these people also tend to display narcissistic behavior. And the irony is that they tend not to follow their own rigid should and shouldn't rules, but are quick to judge and point out when they witness someone else not living up to their skewed standards. Unfortunately, we all know some people like that, right? Now, people with this filter, if their should doesn't happen, that person feels that you're always wrong. And that's judgmental, right? And it's almost impossible to recover from. But remember, all judgment is really self-judgment. So the reason you can't recover from it is because that person is really emotionally damaged. They're not experiencing life. They're experiencing the life that they're focused on. The other filter is just your typical expectancy, right? Because we're outwardly facing, right? We're always unconsciously looking for something or someone to make us feel good inside. So expectations are tied to desires due to our lack. It's based around what I call impact bias, is when you think that a future event will have a bigger impact than it actually does in reality. So for example, if you're on like a dating app and you're swiping and you make a connection and you book a date, right? Your filters and your expectations and your imagination will start to run amok, and you'll play that date out in your head before you actually go on the actual date. And so when you're actually on the actual date, your expectations of what has already played out in your head, you'll be starting to scrub and filter against that, which allows most of us to not really be present and really just enjoy the date because our expectations have already played out in our heads and we're sitting there waiting for those expectations to happen. So expectations are usually based in future, or worse, they're based around someone's past pain that is now informing their future fears. So it's part of our imagination, it's part of our meaning making machine. And those are important functions around our thinking that you'll learn when you take our online courses. So someone that has expectations usually has not communicated that to the other person and is typically living through their fantasy and imagination. So when the present moment actually happens and the expectation isn't met, that person is almost certainly disappointed. And all of that is based around the feelings that people are placing on things that are now impacting their emotions. And what I say is that people are unconsciously creating their own chaos and then playing victims in it. And I hope that makes sense. Now, going back to vibration and harmony, if two things match, then all is groovy, right? We know that. But if there's incongruency, there's an emotional signature that is usually assigned, and that signature is usually a negative emotional reaction. It's between EP and RP. Then there's a positive emotion. If there's a greater difference between EP and RP, then there's always a negative emotion. Now, for example, let's take this recent Super Bowl. If your expectations and preference was that your team, the Kansas City Chiefs, were to win the Super Bowl, and as we know, in actual reality, they did, your emotional reaction was probably a happy one, right? But if your actual team was, in some cases, the loss could have triggered, the more skewed an individual's belief system is towards the win, the more likely the eruption of anger will happen. It's really because there's a stronger attachment to the team as part of their identity. So when the team loses, they feel a part of them loses. And it's really true because they've attached meaning to the importance of the success of the team as an extension of who they believe themselves to be, especially if they fall in that should and shouldn't filter category. Here's an aha moment. Are you ready? If you're like my oldest son, who didn't care about any of the two teams that were playing, so he had no expectations or preference, that allowed him to view the game and be present with no attachments to outcomes and results. In other words, he had no emotional reaction to the results because the equation was disrupted. And here's the aha moment. Fan, and last weekend was UFC 2. I was curious to see how Volkanovski was going to handle Topuria. It was Tupuria's unwavering confidence around his faith and him saying that he is meant to be champion, and he had no doubt that he'd be crowned champion when all is said and done. And that was intriguing to me. It was empowering and it was convincing. He was actually very convincing. However, something came up, so I wasn't able to catch the main event live. I ended up catching the highlights on social media, so my perceived reality was removed. So my reaction was neutral when I found out the results, because again, the equation was disrupted. Again, any disruption within the equation will affect the reaction. You usually have little to no reaction when one of the two factors are removed. Now back to anger. So anger does have its place. There's healthy angers like snaps, right? And it's like animalistic, like a dog that snaps at his offspring that says, playtime is over, or you yelling at your older sibling saying, stop it. Those are forms of healthy anger that we need to embrace because it actually helps us release that energy out of our body and prevents it from building up. But we need our warrior energy to effectively warn others when they're crossing the line or have crossed the line, right? We need to give them that warning, right? We just don't need that warrior energy to warn and then destroy around pointless matters. But there's a difference between healthy anger and prolonged anger, and we need to know the truth about prolonged anger. Prolonged anger is used for loneliness or fear of abandonment, right? So Katrina, you mentioned not being able to say what or how you really feel. And that's a form of fear of confrontation, fearing that you'll be rejected if your words are not received in the way that you expect or prefer. Starting to see the connection there? So your anger is masking some authentic feelings that you need to address and resolve. So everyone should know that this is common. I certainly did it a lot before I became aware. And the people that I work with do it until I introduce them to tools to help them tap in, tune in, and turn on. Anger is a coping method. It's really a form of survival. We're unknowingly perpetuating the very thing that we're trying to avoid. It's a form of self-sabotage. So we're afraid to be vulnerable and authentic because when we were young, trying to express our authenticity was often mistaken for bad behavior. So we learned being authentic was a threat to our attachment to our caregivers and our loved ones. So that became a defining moment to you, to me, to everyone that's listening. And it became a defining moment for our amygdalas. And when that happens, the thought of being vulnerable is rejected by our nervous system. This now becomes an unconscious reaction, like a trauma response, right? So it's like we really want to say what we want to say, but then we get angry. It's like, I can't say that, right? And then we really want to touch out and we want to hug the person, but we get angry. And so that's the thing that we need to manage and we need to control. We need the courage to actually step into our vulnerability because vulnerability is the gateway to true connection, really true connection to ourselves. But if you don't say what's on your mind, the resentment always builds up. I always tell people the fear of confrontation is not the enemy. It's the silent resentment that always builds up and manifests in uglier ways. It usually manifests in anger, right? But there's always a reason for bad, unwanted behavior. We need to stop asking what's wrong with that person and start asking what happened to that person to make them act that way. It's always around someone's hidden insecurities based on. So here's another aha moment, right? So people that suffer from loneliness, feeling unloved or misunderstood, can channel these strong, authentic feelings into racket feelings that mask the true feelings that lie at the core. So when you break it down even further, it's always around an individual's insecurities. The insecurities that were formed when our authenticity was not received by our caregivers, which caused us to abandon parts of ourselves, right? And those were defining moments that created trauma imprints, which are strong somatic symptoms of emotional distress. Emotions are the language of the body. So real regulations is having an understanding what your body is trying to communicate to you in the moment and unpacking it in a way to achieve harmony. Your emotions are your indicators between the vibrations of your thoughts in this moment and the thoughts of that broader part of you that always knows. So true regulation is knowing how to regulate your own sensitivities to mitigate your reactivities, because your reactivities almost always guarantees that you'll activate someone else's sensitivities. Kind of confusing, right? So I'll say it in the terms that we're used to hearing. True regulation is knowing how to regulate your personal insecurities, to control your triggers, because your triggers almost always guarantees that you'll trigger someone else's personal insecurities. Anger is a very destructive emotional state and has destructive consequences. Your body gets triggered, so your mind and body get prepared to act. And that action is an emotional reaction void of any intelligence, because the connection to your prefrontal cortex, where executive decisions are made, has gone offline. As Shaolin Master Shi Heng Yi said, angry, the tongue becomes wicked, right? And your body is geared up for battle. And with no tools to snap your conscious back into your prefrontal cortex, back into your human brain, you will remain an animal and ego. And that's our older brain areas that are void of any human logic other than preloaded survival responses. Now, the term back in the day used to be that they flipped their lid, which is kind of accurate because the flip is actually the disconnection from the frontal lobe. But as your anger subsides, right? You calm down, you're like the Hulk and your clothes are all ripped up, and then you kind of shrink into your normal body. You're actually coming back into your prefrontal cortex, back into your human brain. And that's when we usually feel remorse. We feel sorry for acting out of character. And that's when we say to ourselves, we never really share with other people, right? Because that would be being vulnerable. But we usually talk to ourselves, if we can really admit this, we usually say, why did I do that? I know I shouldn't have done that. I don't know why I do that. I don't know why I do that all the time, right? We usually have those private conversations with ourselves. And here's an important fact. You can only emotionally meet people equal to or below your level of awareness and consciousness. If you don't have it, you can't give it or receive it. And that is why you need to work on ways to improve your emotional intelligence. So let's find out what emotional intelligence is. Emotional intelligence, by definition, is communicate effectively, empathize with others, overcome challenges, and diffuse conflicts, right? To me, emotional intelligence is everything, which is why it's one of the three pillars that I'm constantly focused on, right? Again, it's empowerment, emotional intelligence, and efficiency. So emotional intelligence requires three kinds of focus. So let's learn what those three focuses are. So let's find out focus number one, which is considered inner focus. And that is also considered our interpersonal intelligence. It's our strong ethical author. Now, there's a famous neurologist named Antonio Damasio who specialized in the circuitry between the frontal cortex, which again is our executive function, and the emotional center, the midbrain, otherwise known as our amygdala, that we've been saying, which is the radar for danger that triggers our strong emotions, right? So he concluded when it comes to big decisions, we need to draw on our life experiences, and that requires us to have a rich connection with our gastrointestinal tract, otherwise known as our gut. Hence the term gut feeling. They're actually called somatic markers, and it's the language of the body. So, interpersonal intelligence is the intelligence of self. It's the intelligence of self awareness. So, you need to know what you're feeling and experiencing. And more importantly, you need to know why. And when you ask the question why, as simple as it sounds, you're now engaging in your prefrontal cortex, and that is the mind body connection. You're now able to apply critical thinking, void of emotions. And this takes practice. Attention is actually a mental muscle that needs to be flexed quite often. So mindfulness exercises actually strengthens the connection and function of our sympathetic systems. So the sympathetic is our fight or flight. That's when we get amped up, right? And our parasympathetic is our calm window of tolerance. That's our rest and digest. In fact, study shows that mindfulness induces positive structural connectivity and increases the capacity to perceive internal experiences way beyond cognitive training and cognitive therapy. So after you continue to practice and you get a better handle on your own insecurities and sensitivities to navigate your intrapersonal intelligence, the next thing around emotional intelligence is focus number 2, which is being able to read people. And this is considered interpersonal intelligence. So interpersonal intelligence, by definition, is the ability to relate well with people and manage relationships, right? But there are elements to interpersonal intelligence. You actually have to have empathy in order to do that effectively. But there are 3 kinds of empathy. So let's learn what they are. The first empathy is called cognitive empathy, which means that I understand how you think about things. I get a sense of who you are and how you see the world. And as a result, I'm now able to communicate with you in a way that you can better understand, in a way that resonates with you. So when you're able to speak to all kinds of people from all walks of life, you're able to get a higher engagement because you're able to recognize them, or as I say, recognize them. Get it? The next empathy is called emotional empathy, which means that you immediately get a felt sense of what's going on with other people. You can relate to people on an emotional level. The third empathy is called empathetic concern. And this is, I know how you think and how you feel, and I'm also prone to help you now. And this is really around compassion, which is very rare because society makes it very easy for us to be complicit in the suffering of others. So the third and final focus is considered outer focus. And this is key for formulating strategies like planning and designing your life, right? You need to understand the environment in which you operate. You need to understand and be able to read rooms. You need to read social cues, people's affects and tones, and so on. You also need to know what's going to make you thrive right now and what you'll need in the future, and so on. So this is really big picture thinking. So inner focus is really about self-awareness and self-management, and outer focus and reading people is about social awareness and relationship management. And those are the 5 components to emotional intelligence. So you need to know our higher version that we aspire to be, right? We're unconsciously always judging ourselves against that version. And once we have self-awareness, we can consciously measure our behavior and actions against that higher version. And now we're able to self-manage. Once we're able to manage ourselves, then we become less reactive to our sensitivities, and thus our amygdala is no longer signaling these false alarms. So we reached the key takeaway moment. So I'm going to give you one key takeaway and maybe a bonus. And I'm also going to give you a tool at the very end to help you start to improve on your emotional intelligence. So this takeaway is going to be a little bit different because we've covered a lot, and I'm going to try to tie it all back together. I'm going to bring it back to fear and love because when it's all said and done, that's what it's all about. So the majority of our online courses follow the principles behind defining moments. The key word is defining moments. So number 1 is the departure, and that is leaving the known outer world of fear and self-loathing. Number 2, we call it the initiation, and that is becoming aware of the unknown inner world, and that is the energy of love. Number 3 is the training, which is accepting and adapting to the unknown inner world. And once you accept and adapt, then you hit number 4, and that is the return. That is going back to the known outer world with new inner world perspective that makes all the difference. Now, if you look at Superman, Wonder Woman, Star Wars, Black Panther, Iron Man, and my favorite, The Matrix, they all follow this format. The hero Shiro's journey has always been a metaphor for the challenges in becoming our authentic self, and is the best example of helping others gain rapid perspective and awareness of the current world as they see it versus the world that is possible. Now, let's look at the last two parts of the Matrix as we see it to shed some light on what's really behind our anger issues. Number one, or number two, or no, actually number three, since it's the last two parts, right, is the training, and that is applying and accepting the unknown inner world. Now, as Joseph Campbell says, it's the hero Shiro undergoes a series of training to learn a new way of life that will be in alignment with their path and their purpose, right? And this process is always met with several failures and setbacks, which requires a mentor to step in and be the voice of reason to push them through to what is obvious to the mentor, but not yet obvious to the hero Shiro. Now, I say hero Shiro because I always try to be gender neutral as much as possible. Now, using the Matrix as an example, Neo receives training and lots of advice from Morpheus, right? And is pushed beyond his initial limits to build both his key, his emotional and physical flexibility. Now, Neo continues to doubt Morpheus, who at this point in the journey believes in Neo more than Neo believes in himself. So let's break it down for us in real life, right? So we have to address our fears. What is actually driving our fears? Again, it's the insecure narratives that lie at the subconscious level. We need to accept the past that caused these false and limiting beliefs, which again is always around a perceived lack and inadequacies. And the top three are not good enough, not lovable, and not worthy. And mine was not lovable. But when I applied new conscious thought and challenged the narrative with new updated information as an adult, it allowed me to disconfirm those old beliefs and accept and love the old wounded parts of me. And this is how I slayed and conquered my angry Black man persona. I was no longer attached to the meaning of not being lovable, so I no longer associated that with my identity. My perceived reality was removed. Final defining moment, which is the return, which is going back to the known outer world with new inner world perspective that makes all the difference. Using Joseph Campbell's example, the hero Shiro returns to the familiar world reconnected and rejuvenated. Reconnected is the key, with new clear perspective, and as a result, the hero Shiro is now one with themselves and embraces their new powers. The hero Shiro feels worthy, loved, and full of confidence, now knowing their truth and their purpose. Now, using the Matrix as an example, Neo is killed by the agent, but is reborn through the power of love, represented by a kiss from Trinity, who represents the Holy Spirit. Having been touched by the source represented in a kiss, Neo encounters the infamous agents for a final showdown with new confidence and belief as he completes his conscious transformation into the One. With no more fear controlling his action, he is now able to exert control over space and time, which further confirms that he is worthy and he is now comfortable with his truth and his true purpose. Now, going back to real life, going back to me as an example, I no longer had that flame of fury that ignited me, right? So I was no longer as sensitive. So I was not easily triggered anymore. Moving in the energy of love allows you to tap into those latent qualities like compassion and empathy. So you no longer see people attacking your character. You actually stop seeing all of the false threats. And instead, you start seeing people's anger as, but it's being blocked by the amygdala, by the shadow and the ego in the form of pride. Why? Because we're outwardly facing, blindly chasing things in the outer world, which is preventing the majority of people to turn inwards to discover their own inner world. We're numbing and we're dumbing down our connection to self. The inner world is where the magic resides. It's where the treasures we all seek live. And when you make it a defining moment, like Katrina did, to look inward and address your lack and inadequacy narratives that's buried deep inside your subconscious, that's when your life changes. That's when the affliction subsides. Your flame of fury actually starts to burn slower. When you're no longer afraid, no longer vibrating in fear, you're connected back into the energy of love. You're actually in the vortex of love. And that's when the amygdala is no longer sending out these false alarms. You're more present, you're more conscious, you're living in your prefrontal cortex, your human brain, and when you're in your human brain, there's no more animal and ego reactions. This is pure consciousness that leads to conscious response rooted in your truth. You're now worthy and mindful. And when you're mindful, you can start to control space and time, and you can see those agents for what they are, which are false threats that are inferior to your new superpowers. So I'm going to leave you a mention when we're stressed, pausing for 90 seconds and labeling what we're feeling, like I'm frustrated, I'm mad, I'm angry, tamps down the activity in the amygdala. MRI studies of the brain show that this emotional labeling calms the brain region involved in angry outbursts and helps you regain control. And that is your new superpower. Now, the tool I'm going to give you is called ICE. And it's designed to cool off your anger and heated emotions. It's actually an acronym, and it stands for Identify, Inquire, Challenge, which is the key, and Edit. So most of you know, and if you don't, I've had inner peace for about 6 years now. So I'm pretty zen the majority of the time because of my daily practice in gratitude and priming, but I'm still human and I'm still a work in progress. And in the quantum world, anything and everything is still possible. So my son can still trigger the front door out of me. So let's use this tool using my son and I as an example. So the first step is to identify the emotion, and I gamify it to immediately pull me into my prefrontal cortex. Also, the people that I coach, I always tell them to name their anger, like angry Andy or angry Amy. And in my case, I use my dad. So I say it's my dad. Next step is to inquire. And for me, this is 2 quick steps. The first step, I ask, do I need my dad to pop in right now? And the answer is usually no. And then the second step is, why am I feeling angry? And here's the key. 9 times out of 10, again, the anger is masking a true feeling. So again, using my son as an example, what I say to myself is, I'm really afraid that I'm not being the father that my son needs me to be right now. So when he acts up, I'm really scared. And I'm getting mad at myself, and I'm displaying that anger onto him. Was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And usually the rager was already in a lousy mood. It's called lousy local condition. And usually when I displace my anger onto him, I'm already in a kind of lousy mode, or either I'm tired or fatigued or running low on energy. Next, I edit the narrative. And this is key because this is how we actually inward instead of focusing outward on the behavior, right? So I'm no longer looking at him acting up. And that changes our lens, especially when we update the narrative. By now, we know that a negative narrative is not going to give you a positive outcome, right? It's not going to keep you operating in the black. That negative narrative is tied to a false belief. And I teach people never define yourself by moments in time. You're still in the game. It's a long journey, right? You're still able to improve on any inadequacy as long as you're intentional about it. Now, using me as an example, I tell myself regarding my son that I'm still in the game. I'm aware of the things that I need to do. And most importantly, I'm active in my son's life. So there is no right or wrong. There's no judgment, only self-reflection. And then I ask, am I doing the best that I know how with the information that I currently have? And I also ask, am I committed to doing better? And the answer is yes to both of those questions, which allows me to now control space and time within my superpowers of staying present. So the bonus takeaway should be that we often straddle the line between fantasy and reality. And when we're in fantasy, we're not able to be vulnerable or authentic. It's our number one fear, right? It's a fear of being rejected. But when we zoom in, what we're really doing when we're not being authentic is we're rejecting ourselves. And that's enough to make us all angry. Now you know. One love. Today's episode was sponsored by Help to Love, a platform to open your mind, achieve mental agility, and integrate into the person that you're meant to be. With a wealth of resources and expert advice at your fingertips, Help to Love makes prioritizing your mental well-being easier than ever. It's a non-judgmental approach to mental wellness to help you design that 10x life you deserve. Sign up today at www.helptolove.com. Join the thousands of users who have already discovered the transformative power. Register for the free webinar that will open your mind and plant seeds for your ultimate breakthrough. If you felt this episode was helpful and insightful, please like, share, and subscribe so that you'll be notified of all of our upcoming content and special announcements.
I'm E.O. Brooks, your host. As always, I thank you for your support and especially your time. One love.